Hi, boys and girls. Miss Kathy here from Shaler, North Hills Library for another episode of Greek Myth Mania. And this week we are featuring the travels of Odysseus. We did the Trojan War and the Trojan Horse, which was mostly Odysseus's idea that won the war for them. And now, yay, they are free to go home. But getting home is a little more of a problem. So we're going to read about that. Let's talk about Odysseus before the war. And I'm not going to be using Delaire's book because Delaire doesn't really go into Odysseus too much. Odysseus is a hero from the famous poem The Odyssey, written by Homer back in a long time ago, and is one of the most famous epic poems, epic meaning it tells a big long story, in history. So he doesn't get into that too much because Odysseus is another work of literature, and he's not a Greek god, he's a hero. So for various, whatever his reasonings were, he's not really in that book. So I'm going to be using a couple different books here. This first one I'm going to start out with is the Weird But True one that we've been doing, because that talks about Odysseus before the war began. So, meanwhile, Odysseus was doing all he could to avoid going to war. That was back when the war first started. In fact, to avoid going to war, he pretended he had gone insane. He hitched his donkey to a plow and began sowing his fields with salt instead of seeds. People were onto him, though. To test his mental well-being, a man placed his own, Odysseus's, baby son in front of Odysseus's plow. The king made an abrupt turn to avoid plowing over his own baby, and that proved that he was mentally sane, and poor Odysseus had to head into battle. He really just wanted to stay at home and be a family man. He had a new baby, he had a wonderful wife, Penelope, and now he has to go far away, and as it turns out, the war lasts 10 years, we talked about. So he's gone for a long time without seeing his family. Remember, this is the day before cell phones and Skyping and all of those wonderful ways we have now to keep in touch with people that aren't around. Here it tells us a little bit about Odysseus and the poem The Odyssey. It was written by the poet Homer in the 8th century BC. So that is about almost close to 3,000 years ago. It has been translated into 250 different languages, and 45 million copies of the book have been sold around the world. So, very, very famous poem. So that was about him going off to war. Now, we're going to pick up in this one called Usborne Greek Myth Book, and we are going to read about him coming home from the war, because that's the main focus of the journey. So the Greeks divided the Trojans' treasure between them, loaded up their ships, and joyfully rode away from the ruined city of Troy. And because I'm going to be sitting up reading for a little while here, I'm going to slide back, get a little bit comfy so you can slide back, get a little bit comfy, and just sit back and listen. Odysseus and his men set sail, and in a great storm, which lasted for days, became separated from the other ships. When the sea was calm again, they were alone. They sailed on, stopping at islands where sometimes the crew had to fight battles to escape, and sometimes were welcomed and given food and water. Storms drove their ships across wild seas and past rocky shores where they couldn't land. When the wind dropped, they had to row until they were too tired to go on. One idea I have as you're listening, if you don't want to just sit there, is to print out that packet of papers we have, and there are some coloring sheets at the back of that packet. You could color while you listen, one of the sheets about Odysseus. Just a thought. So here's the first of the adventures they have. Cyclops, the one-eyed giant. After many months, Odysseus and his men reached an island where they landed to find food and water. There were no people, but at the top of the cliff they could see a huge cave. "We'd better explore," said Odysseus. He picked up a skin full of wine and led his men across the island. As they found no one, they decided to climb the cliff to the cave. Odysseus stopped at the entrance, peered in, and shouted, "Anyone there?" There was no reply. He stepped in and looked around. In the cave were enormous bowls of milk and cheese. "Let's eat while we wait for the owners to come back," Odysseus said to his hungry men. Suddenly they heard a thunderous noise and sprang to their feet. A Cyclops, a giant with only one eye in the middle of his forehead, filled the entrance, blocking out the sun. He herded a flock of sheep into the cave. Then he rolled a massive rock across the entrance to close it like a door. The Cyclops glared at the Greeks with his one huge eye. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my cave?" he roared. "We are Greek soldiers on our way home to Ithaca from Troy," said Odysseus. "We were looking for fresh food and water." Before they could move, the Cyclops grabbed 2 men in his enormous fist and stuffed them into his mouth. Odysseus' men stared in horror. "Quick, get behind those rocks," whispered Odysseus. And they dashed to a dark corner of the cave. They watched the Cyclops lie down and go to sleep. "We must kill him before he eats us all," whispered one of the men. "No," replied Odysseus. Can you think of what the problem would be with doing that? If we kill him, we'll be trapped in here. We'd never be able to move that rock from the entrance. We must wait. I'll show you the pictures here. Slide you up a little bit so you can see a little bit closer up here. And there they are in the cave, with just the feet of the giant laying over there and some of the sheep. Next morning, the Cyclops woke up, rolled away the rock, and herded his sheep out of the cave. Before Odysseus and his men could slip out, he rolled the rock back again, trapping them inside the cave. "I have a plan," said Odysseus. "I need a big wooden pole." They searched the cave until they found one and hid behind some rocks. Then they waited until the Cyclops came back. In the evening, the Cyclops rolled back the rock and herded in his sheep. Closing the entrance again, Odysseus poured wine from his wineskin into a huge bowl. He offered it to the Cyclops, who drank the wine, and Odysseus filled the bowl again. "What's your name?" asked the Cyclops. "I'm called Nobody," said Odysseus, pouring more wine into the bowl. "That's a very strange name," laughed the Cyclops, and lay down and was soon snoring loudly. "Now's our chance," Odysseus said to his men. "Bring me the pole from behind the rocks." Holding the pole, Odysseus crept up to the sleeping Cyclops and pushed it into his one eye. The Cyclops leapt up and stumbled around the cave, shouting and roaring. Must have hurt. The other Cyclops on the island heard the noise. "What's the matter?" they called. "Nobody has hurt me. Nobody has blinded me," cried the Cyclops. "Well, if nobody has hurt you, why are you making all that noise?" they asked, and they went back to their caves, muttering, "He's gone crazy." Next morning, the Cyclops rolled away the rock from the cave to let out his sheep. "You'll never escape," he shouted. But Odysseus had a plan. He tied the sheep together in threes. "Lie down and hold on to a middle sheep," he ordered his men. As the sheep trotted past the Cyclops, he stroked their backs, but he didn't feel the men clinging on underneath. When they were all outside the cave, Odysseus shouted, "Run for the ship!" They raced down to the shore and rowed their ship away as fast as they could. The Cyclops heard them go and roared with rage. He hurled huge rocks at the ship, but as he couldn't see it, they all missed. Odysseus and his men thought they were safe. The Cyclops was the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea. He begged his father to take revenge on the Greeks who had blinded him. Poseidon promised he would punish them. So if you're starting on a long voyage, it's not a good idea to anger the god of the sea, Poseidon, huh? Let's see what happens next. A bag of winds. So there's no pictures on this page. So Odysseus and his men sailed on and landed on another island. There King Aeolus, who was the keeper of the winds, welcomed them. He held feasts for them, and they stayed happily for many weeks with the king, his wife, and their sons and daughters. When it was time to leave, King Aeolus gave Odysseus a leather bag. "I've put in it the north, south, and east winds," he said, "but left out the west wind. This gentle wind will blow you eastward to Ithaca." Odysseus thanked the king and took the bag on board his ship. As soon as the crew hoisted the sail, the west wind wafted the ship along. Odysseus didn't tell his men what was in the leather bag, and they were curious. One day, when Odysseus was asleep, one man said, "Let's open the bag, perhaps there's treasure in it," and he untied it. Out flew the north, south, and east winds in a terrible storm, which blew the ship back the way it had come. There was nothing they could do to stop it. Curiosity couldn't contain themselves. The ship raced on, and at last reached another island. Odysseus sent a group of men, led by Eurylochus, to find food and water, while he and the other men guarded the ship. He didn't want to be captured by more giants. Eurylochus and his friends set off and walked for hours without meeting anyone. At last they saw a palace through the trees. When they reached it, a beautiful woman came out. She smiled at them. "I'm Circe. Come in. You must be hungry." She led them into a huge hall where huge plates of food were laid on a table. The men ate and drank as much as they could. They laughed and sang, thanked Circe for her kindness, and didn't even notice that Eurylochus wasn't with them. He had been suspicious of this woman. When the men had gone into the palace, he had stayed outside and watched through a window. As soon as the feast was over, Circe waved her magic wand, and the men instantly turned into pigs. Then she drove them, grunting, out of the palace. Eurylochus ran back to the ship and told Odysseus what he had seen. "I must rescue them," said Odysseus, and picking up his weapons, he ran to the palace. On the way, he was startled to see Hermes, the messenger of the gods, flying near him. "The goddess Athena sent me to give you this flower," called Hermes. "Eat it and you'll be safe from Circe's magic." Odysseus thanked him and quickly ate the white flower. When he reached the palace, Circe came out to meet him. "Come in," she smiled. "You must be hungry." Odysseus thanked her and went in, certain he would be safe. Circe handed him a cup of wine which had a magic potion in it. She watched Odysseus drink it, and then tapped his arm with her magic wand. Instead of turning into a pig, Odysseus jumped up and pointed his sword at her. "Take me to my men," he ordered. Circe was terrified because her magic hadn't worked. She led Odysseus out of the palace to the pen full of pigs. "Change them back," commanded Odysseus. Circe rubbed magic ointment over the pigs, and immediately they became human again. "Come back to my palace, and we will have another feast. No more magic potions, I promise you," said Circe. Odysseus and his men accepted. They sent for the men guarding the ship and stayed with Circe, enjoying themselves for a whole year. At last Odysseus sighed and said, "It's time we went home." Circe was very sad. She had fallen in love with Odysseus, but knew he had to leave her. She gave him food and water for the voyage, and warned him of the many new dangers that were ahead. Odysseus's ship sailed on and soon came to a very rocky island. Here sirens, who were sea nymphs, sat on the rocks and sang enchanting songs to the ships that passed. Sailors were lured to the island, their ships were wrecked on the rocks, and they were drowned. Circe had warned Odysseus about the sirens, but he wanted to hear their songs. "Tie me to the mast," he told his men, "and then fill your ears with beeswax. Don't take it out until we are well past this island." They did as he ordered. Then they started to row. The sirens sang their enchanting songs, but the men couldn't hear them. Furious that the ship was getting away, the sirens sang louder and louder. Only Odysseus fell under their spell and struggled with the ropes that held him. "Untie me! Let me free! They're calling me! I must go to them!" he shouted. But the men couldn't hear him. They rowed steadily on and on until they were at the safe distance. Then they untied Odysseus's ropes and took the wax out of their ears. Odysseus and his men sailed on until in front of them they saw towering cliffs with a narrow channel between them. Then they heard a great roaring noise. In the channel was a giant whirlpool, a mass of swirling water which sucked ships down to the bottom of the sea. It was called Charybdis. They had to go through the channel. There was no other way. Odysseus shouted, "Row as hard as you can. Pull for your lives." He steered the ship as close to the cliffs as he dared, so they could slip past the whirlpool. The men rowed hard, watching the whirlpool. They didn't see the Scylla, the six-headed monster, loom out of her cave high up on the cliffs. Suddenly she shot out her 6 heads and snatched up 6 men. They shouted once, then were silent. She had swallowed them. "Row on!" shouted Odysseus. Soon the ship was out of reach of the Scylla and past the whirlpool Charybdis. The wind blew, filling the big sail, and the tired crew could rest. The ship soon reached another island. Odysseus warned his men not to touch the cows there. They belonged to the god Helios, he said, the sun god. The men hunted wild animals and fish to eat, but when Odysseus was away from the camp, they killed and roasted a calf. When Odysseus returned and found them eating meat, he was afraid. "The gods will punish us for this," he said. Helios found out what they'd done and was very angry. After a week on the island, Odysseus and his crew put to sea again. At first, the ship sailed gently along, but then the wind grew stronger and stronger. Dark clouds filled the sky and thunder crashed. The storm had been sent by Helios. "Take down the sail!" shouted Odysseus. The crew struggled, but it was too late. The mast snapped and fell over the side. Then a huge wave washed over the ship, turning it over and sinking it. Odysseus clung to the broken mast, shouting again and again to his men. But they had all drowned. The wind and waves pushed the mast along until 9 days later it washed up on a beautiful island, another one. The island was ruled by the goddess Calypso. She took Odysseus to her palace, where he lived enchanted by her under a spell for 7 more years. She loved him and begged him to stay with her forever, but each day he sat on the beach, staring out to sea and longing for his rocky island of Ithaca. At last, the goddess Athena went to Zeus and said, "It's time we help this wanderer go home." Zeus agreed and sent his messenger Hermes to tell Calypso she must let Odysseus go. Calypso had to obey the order and gave Odysseus the wooden tools he needed to build a boat. When it was finished, Calypso sadly said goodbye to Odysseus. He sailed for days with a good breeze, but then Poseidon, still trying to avenge his son the Cyclops, whom Odysseus had blinded, sent a terrible storm. It wrecked the small ship and flung Odysseus into the sea. Athena wouldn't let Odysseus drown. She watched as he clung to the wreck of his ship until he saw land. He swam to it and crawled, soaked and exhausted, up the beach, where he lay in despair. Next morning, a princess was walking along the shore and found Odysseus still lying on the beach. She took him to her father, King Acrisius, or King Alcinous, who greeted him kindly and fed him and clothed him. When Odysseus told him of his voyage, the king said, "Your island of Ithaca is quite near here. Stay here tonight, and tomorrow one of my ships will take you home." Finally, home at last. For that, we're going to switch to a different book here. Greek Myths Retold by Jacqueline Maury. The Homecoming of Odysseus. 20 years is a long time to be away from home. As the years passed, most of Odysseus's people forgot him or believed him dead. His son, Telemachus, had been a baby when he left and never knew him. Now, it was 10 years of war and 10 years of getting home. His son is 20. Only his wife Penelope continually thought of him and did not give up hope that he was alive and would return. As the years passed, the nobles of Odysseus's realm began to cast greedy looks at the throne. Telemachus was not powerless to stop them, and Penelope had no one to protect her. Since Odysseus must be dead, whoever married Penelope would be king. Each of these men distrusted the others, and each came himself to the palace to try to win Penelope's hand. No fewer than 108 suitors turned up and said they would stay until Penelope had chosen one of them as her husband. They were arrogant and boisterous, drinking Odysseus's wine and killing his herds for their feasts. This broke all rules of courtesy, for as suitors they should have brought splendid presents for Penelope, and each put on a feast for all the others at their own expense. Penelope despised and feared these shameless spongers, yet she could not make them leave. To keep the suitors' good humor, she promised to choose a husband when she had finished weaving the cloth on her loom. Every day she worked at her loom, yet every night she secretly undid all that she had done during the day. For 3 years she kept the suitors waiting until they grew suspicious and bribed a maid to follow her. Then her trick was discovered. "Choose a husband," they said, "and let there be a king in Ithaca." But Penelope would not choose. Then the suitors began to look evilly at Telemachus, who would soon be old enough to throw them out. Hearing he had sailed in search of his father, they planned to waylay his ship and murder him as he returned. Let me see, I wanted to go back to this book at some point. Let me see where that point was. Get the Scylla and Charybdis. Okay, so, meanwhile, back to Odysseus. Odysseus boarded the ship that the king had given him and lay down and fell asleep. He was still fast asleep when the ship reached Ithaca. The sailors carried him ashore and left him on the beach. Then they sailed away. Poseidon, the god of the sea, was watching. He was angry that Odysseus had reached home safely, and to take revenge on the sailors who helped him, he rose above the waves and pointed at the ship. In an instant, the ship turned to stone. Poseidon smiled and sank down into the sea again. That's kind of horrible, huh? They were innocent. Odysseus woke up on the beach and looked around him. He didn't know where he was. Suddenly, a beautiful woman appeared. "I am the goddess Athena," she said. "I've come to help you. You've been away from Ithaca for so long. Many people think you're dead and will never come back. The nobles on the island want to marry your wife Penelope and take over your kingdom." Odysseus leapt up. "I must go and save her," he said. "Not so fast," said Athena. "These men want to get rid of your son Telemachus, and they will kill you too. But I have a plan. I'll disguise you as an old beggar. You are then to go to the swineherd's hut. I'll send Telemachus to meet you there." She raised her hand, and Odysseus at once looked like an old beggar dressed in rags. He thanked Athena and hurried to the hut. The swineherd didn't recognize Odysseus. "Come in and eat with me," he said. "There's not much, but you must be hungry." Odysseus thanked him, and after they had eaten, he said, "Tell me what's happening in Ithaca." "Bad news," said the swineherd. "King Odysseus sailed for Troy 20 years ago, and hasn't been heard of since." The door of the hut opened, and a tall young man stepped in. "Prince Telemachus!" cried the swineherd, jumping up. "Who's this?" asked Telemachus, looking at Odysseus. Odysseus stood up. "I am your father," he said. "You can't be. You're a beggar," cried Telemachus. "The goddess Athena disguised me so no one would recognize me," replied Odysseus. "Now I've heard that the nobles want to marry your mother. Tell me about them." Telemachus stared at Odysseus, wondering if what he said was true. Then he said, "They come every day and ask my mother which one of them she will marry. So she used to say she would choose one when she had finished her weaving. But then they found out that each night she unpacked her day's weaving so that it would never be finished. They're really unpleasant now. They eat and drink our food and wine, and I know they want to kill me." Odysseus, Telemachus, and the swineherd hurried to the palace. There the nobles were feasting as usual. Odysseus shambled in and begged for food. They all gave him a few scraps, except for one who threw a stool at him. After the nobles had gone to bed that night, Odysseus and Telemachus took all the weapons from the hall and hid them in the cellar. Penelope had heard there was a beggar in the hall and sent for him. Odysseus kept his face in shadow. He didn't want Penelope to recognize him yet. "Have you heard any news of Odysseus?" asked Penelope. "He is alive and well and will soon return to Ithaca," Odysseus growled to disguise his voice. "Thank you," sighed Penelope. "My old nurse will give you food." Odysseus quietly left the room. When the nobles came into the hall the next morning, Odysseus was there, waiting for them. He listened to them talking and grumbling about Penelope, but said nothing. After they had eaten breakfast, Penelope walked in, carrying a huge bow. "I have decided to give you all a test of strength," she said. "This bow belonged to my husband, Odysseus. I will marry the man who can put the string on and shoot an arrow through the handles of 12 axes." Telemachus set up the target of the 12 axes. The nobles argued about who should go first. They were all eager to show how strong they were. The first one picked up the bow and tried to pull the string, but however hard he struggled, he couldn't even bend the bow. The others jeered at him. Then they tried one after the other, but they all failed. They grumbled that the bow was old and stiff. It wasn't they that weren't strong enough. Odysseus stepped forward. "May I try?" he asked. The nobles jeered. "A beggar wants to marry a queen," sneered one. "Let him try," ordered Penelope. Odysseus whispered to Telemachus, "Take your mother to her room," because he knew what was going to happen. Telemachus hurried away with Penelope and soon returned himself. Very quietly he closed and locked the doors of the hall. Odysseus picked up the bow, bent it easily, and put on the string. He slotted an arrow on the bow, pulled, and shot it straight through the 12 axes. At that moment Athena changed Odysseus from an old beggar back to his usual tall, strong self, dressed in fine clothes and armed with a sharp sword and a long spear. "Odysseus!" gasped the nobles. They reached for their weapons, but found they weren't there. In a panic they rushed for the doors, but they were locked in. One noble managed to slip out and find the weapons hidden in the cellar. Drawing his sword, Telemachus ran to his father's side, and together they fought a terrible battle. Although they were hugely outnumbered, they managed to kill all the nobles. The old nurse, who was hiding behind a pillar, ran to tell Penelope what she had seen. Penelope hurried to the hall. She stared at Odysseus. Trying to see where I want to go over to the other book here. She hadn't seen Odysseus for 20 years. "Are you really my husband, or is this a trick the gods are playing on me?" "Yes, my dear and faithful wife," replied Odysseus. "I am he." Penelope was still not certain and thought of a test. "Go to my bedroom and move the bed into another room," she told the old nurse. "You can't do that. I built that bed around a tree. It can't be moved," said Odysseus. "Only you and I know about that tree. That proves you are really Odysseus," said Penelope, and she threw her arms around him. "Yes, I've come home at last to reclaim my wife and my kingdom and my son," replied Odysseus, smiling at her. "And you'll never believe all the adventures I have to tell you and my brave son Telemachus about." And that is the end of Odysseus. He finally reaches home and had many, many encounters on the way. Okay, let's see about our packet. Well, I guess before we go to there, Treasury of Greek Mythology, Odysseus is just got a few mentions in here. At the back, I don't think it really told me anything that we didn't know before. Let's see. Yeah, let's not do anything in this one. I thought there was page. Anyways, okay, so let's look at our packet here. Greek Mythmania. There is a website and have the story read to you, then take a quiz on it. Watch a video made for kids about Odysseus and the Cyclops, just one part of his story. You can learn about the island of Greece today and some of the many places you can visit that relate to Odysseus at that website. Number 3, here are some sheets with spaces to fill in on each character in the story. So if you're going to go back and maybe go to one of those websites that tell about him, we have the main characters in the story: Odysseus, Penelope, and Telemachus, that family. We have Tiresias, who we didn't get into because these are all names based on the poem, the Odyssey, and we didn't get quite into that. But we know Athena, goddess of wisdom, and she helped Odysseus in several ways. We have, who's on the next sheet? Poseidon, he hurt Odysseus in many ways. We have Zeus and Hermes, other gods that played a role in his voyage getting home. We have Helios, the sun god, from where they killed his sacred cattle. Polyphemus and Calypso. Calypso was the one that kept him under a spell for many long years, actually. Circe also cast the men into pigs. Aeolus was the king of the winds. The sirens were trying to lure sailors to their deaths. And he almost would have let them lure his ship to theirs, but he told his men to keep sailing. And the Scylla and Charybdis. So those are things that you can fill in with more facts about the story. Then we have a word search. We have a crossword puzzle. And we have the answers to the crossword puzzle because these things get a little tricky, and some of them, again, you won't know because it's based on the actual poem, the Odyssey, and other characters that we did not get into in just talking about Odysseus. And then next up is the craft. It was making a piggy because Odysseus's men got turned into piggies. And here's our little piggy. And you can actually use it. You make it out of a cereal box, so you can use it to store things in if you want. Maybe letters or papers or something like that. But it was not too hard to make. If you have an empty cereal box around home you can do that. You just have to cut out some space for the legs and cut it off however big you want your pig to be. And then it tells you, doesn't really give you too many steps because it's fairly straightforward. It says you can paint your box. Well, I covered mine with pink paper. If you don't have pink paint, maybe you want to use paper. You can also use foam if you want a cushiony pig, or even I thought about felt. It would make a nice soft fuzzy pig. And then you cut out a circle for the head, and you cut out some ears, triangle ears for the triangle shape for the ears. You can use googly eyes, or you can just draw some eyes on. I cut out a nose, but you could use a pom-pom or something like that for the nose if you wanted. And then, of course, a curly-Q tail. Now, you may not have a pink pipe cleaner at home. You could use a different color, or you could use just a piece of string or something that hangs down. You could be creative and see what you want to make his tail out of. And then I drew on some black marker to make the hoofs of the pig. So it was pretty easy to do, and I think it turns out cute, and you can actually use it to hold something. Give it to someone. So that was because his men got turned into pigs by Circe when they went to her island. That was one of the first things that happened to them. Then I said there were a number of coloring pages. I printed out 2 here, but there are many others you can get at this website if you want to pick out any others. And then there was, I included with the packet, I didn't have a website for it to put it on the sheet, but there's a route showing the way that Odysseus traveled. His journey from Troy, which is over here, trying to get home, blown by winds to within sight of home. His island is doesn't say. To and from the Pillars of Hercules. Ithaca, here. So he only had to go from Troy to Ithaca, but he got blown off by the winds and all the things that happened to him. Here he ends up with Circe, and then he goes to the Sirens. He has to pass through Charybdis and Scylla, comes down to the island of Calypso, and then finally he heads back home. So that was just a travel map showing his journeys. Now, lastly, there is a rap that was in the back of a book, so I'm going to read it to you because I couldn't post it on the internet. It's not a website, but it is a rap about Homer and the Homettes doing the Odyssey rap. I'm no rapper, but I'm going to give it my best shot. My name is Homer, I'm an old-time poet. I'm one of the ancient Greeks, don't you know it? I'm the boy who told about Troy, how the Greeks got annoyed and Troy got destroyed. Now one of these Greeks, he had a plan. The king of Ithaca was the man. He went by the name of Odysseus. Don't diss, Odysseus. 'Cause he was the man who thought of the plan, the gift of a horse with an inside force that would end the war, make the Greek spirit soar. Yeah, that's the way it happened, that's the way it was. Just feel a blast from the ancient past, 'cause that's what Homer does. Yeah, that's what Homer does. Yeah. Now Odysseus sailed his ships away, but to God of the sea he forgot to pray. So Poseidon got mad and made things bad. He made the sea rise and made Odysseus sad. Poseidon blew poor Ody far, far away, where the whirlpools whirl and the dragons play, where sirens sing and drive you crazy, to Lotus land where you get lazy. Doomed by the lord of the foam to roam, it looked like poor Odysseus would never get home. He ran into a cyclops with one big eye, had to cross a lake of fire to the other side. Then his ship got sunk and his crew was gone. Poor Ody was alone, but he had to carry on. But hey, in the end, a ship from a friend came along to bring Odysseus home again.
He was happy as can be to see Penelope after 20 long years of his Odyssey. Yeah, that's the way it happened, that's the way it was, for epic poems just turn to Homer's. 'Cause that's what Homer does, that's what Homer does. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to win any Emmy Awards or Grammys or anything like that, but it's kind of a fun rhyme, and you can write your own rap if you want to about the Odyssey. So, a bunch of different things you can do to celebrate Odysseus and his return home. I'm going to sign off now and let you go get started on some of them. And me and my little pink piggy are going to remind you, Shaler North Hills Library is open 6 days a week. Check the website for the hours. We are there to serve you. So whether you come in and pick out your own stuff, or if you still want us to pick it out for you and come to our window and pick it up, no problem either way. Just come in and see us today. This has been Miss Kathy from Shaler North Hills Library. Thanks for watching, and I will see you at the next episode of Greek Myth Mania. Bye, guys.